They say that if there's one thing stronger than a farmer's will, it's an HOA board's sense of self-importance. I never really believed that, until the day I found a neat row of tents lining my southern pasture, pitched by strangers who all insisted they had permission from a woman named Karen. My land is the last private parcel in our small community, and though I'm not officially part of the homeowners association, it hasn't stopped them from trying to meddle with how I run my property. Over the years, I've heard the usual complaints. Your fence is an eyesore, or your livestock are too loud. But inviting 100 people to camp on my land, unannounced? That was a new low, even by their standards. I call this woman HOA Karen because she embodies every stereotype you've ever heard of an overbearing official with a clipboard. She stands about 5'4", face perpetually scrunched as if the entire world defends her nose. She sports that brassy blonde bob, the type that makes you think the word manager is about to be demanded. As soon as these campers materialized, I hopped in my truck and drove down the dirt path by my southern fence line, trying to figure out which part of me had taken a left turn into the twilight zone. Imagine my shock when I find a full-blown gathering, complete with fold-out chairs, small bonfires and metal drums, and half a dozen vehicles sprawled under the battered oak trees. A man in cargo shorts and a Live Laugh Love t-shirt was cranking open a cooler of cold drinks, waving like we were old friends. Kids scurried around, excited by the novelty of sleeping in the great outdoors. When I asked them what in tarnation they were doing, they said the lovely HOA representative told them they could set up anywhere they liked. According to them, it was a communal outreach experience, right? Communal outreach on my property without so much as a phone call. Now, I'm a tolerant man. I grew up on this very land, inheriting it from my grandfather who taught me that farmland is more than just acres of dirt. It's a living, breathing entity that demands respect. But on that particular day, with the sun blasting down and a line of invasive tents overshadowing my fence, my patience wore thin. Before confronting the crowd, I dialed the HOA president, an older gentleman named Dwayne who's generally level-headed, and asked him what was going on. Dwayne sounded as bewildered as I was. "Never heard of it," he said, baffled. "We'd never sanction people camping on private land. If it's Karen's doing, she's gone rogue." Rogue didn't do justice to what was unfolding. As I marched through the campsite, I noticed at least a dozen holes dug for campfire pits. My land is usually fallow this time of year, but last week I had started planting a new set of cover crops to enrich the soil. Now, the fragile ground was pocked with ringed stones and ash. Any farmer would tell you that is no minor inconvenience. Each pit threatens to disrupt the soil composition, not to mention the risk of accidental brush fires. Between the incessant giggling of carefree campers and the potential damage to my land, I felt my blood pressure spike. That's when I saw her, Karen herself, standing near one of those portable restroom rentals that someone had the nerve to place right next to my barn. She was berating a young woman who was trying to figure out how to lock the rickety blue door. Seeing Karen in the flesh reminded me of the day she showed up at my doorstep with a list of aesthetic improvements for my property. We had parted on less than friendly terms. She had threatened fines, though the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. I suspected it was only the beginning of her crusade to turn my farmland into some manicured extension of the suburban sprawl. "Karen," I said, forcing a civil tone, "you mind telling me what's going on here?" She turned, and her lips formed a tight smile, the kind you plaster on when you know you're in trouble but think you can charm your way out of it. "Oh, you must be Tom," she said, pretending we weren't already well acquainted. "I was just organizing a weekend retreat for some of our community members. Everyone needed a little getaway, and your place is so wide open. I knew you'd be thrilled to have us here." "Thrilled," I repeated, keeping my arms crossed. "Karen, you never asked for my permission. You have no right to invite people to stay on private property. And you've got 100 folks stomping around, building fires, and ignoring the rules of basic courtesy." She waved a manicured hand, dismissive. "Oh, nonsense. It's for the good of the community. You'll hardly notice we're here." The tone of her voice turned syrupy, like I was the unreasonable one. "Besides," she said in a hushed voice, leaning in, The more hospitable you are, the more likely people will vote in your favor when that rezoning debate comes up. My jaw clenched. She was implying that if I played nice, maybe the HOA wouldn't oppose me on future issues. That's the kind of twisted politics that make me lose respect for folks. But I wasn't about to argue with her in front of this entire campsite. Instead, I forced a thin-lipped smile of my own. "Well, Karen," I said, "just make sure you clean up after yourselves. And next time, a little courtesy call would be nice." Her grin widened, clearly pleased I was letting her win for the moment. But deep down, I was already planning my next move. You see, I have a particular morning ritual on this farm. I let my bulls out at sunrise. Normally, I pen them in a separate corral until I'm ready to supervise their grazing. They're not the friendliest beasts in the world, but they do their job. They keep certain pests away, and occasionally, they remind folks not to mess around with farmland. Karen and her band of merry campers had no inkling that the break of dawn on my property comes with heavy hoofbeats and snorting behemoths. And I had a feeling they'd learn soon enough, one way or another. Sunrise on my farm is usually a serene spectacle. The horizon blushes a brilliant orange, dew sparkles on the tall blades of grass, and the roosters proclaim the arrival of a new day. I've always found it therapeutic, like a daily rebirth of hope and purpose. But the next morning, as I stepped into my barn's main aisle, the tension in my shoulders reminded me of the unwelcome campers dotting my southern pasture. Even at that early hour, I could hear snores and the occasional cough echoing across my fields. People were sprawled out in tents they'd erected in neat but invasive rows. Their vehicles sat parked at odd angles, and a few portable lights still flickered after an all-night chat session around the fire pits. I inspected my bulls in their sturdy pen. Doc, the largest, had a grumpy disposition that could scare the hat off any grown man who didn't know better. Right behind him was Butch, who was older but no less ornery. I had a few others, ranging from the gentler brood to the ones with the easy-to-provoke streak. Normally, I'd release them only into the enclosed grazing area to ensure they didn't wander off and wreak havoc. But I'd spent half the night thinking of how to get rid of those trespassers without inviting legal trouble. A direct confrontation or calling the law might paint me in a bad light. And that can be costly if the HOA tries to twist the narrative. Releasing the bulls at sunrise onto my own land, however, well, no one could say I was doing anything illegal if I was simply letting my livestock graze their usual route. Still, it gave me pause. I wasn't looking to harm anyone, only to jolt them into realizing they had overstepped. My bulls were used to me and my family, but 100 strangers? That was a different equation. They might panic, or worse, do something reckless like try to chase the animals or shoot at them. I decided on a compromise. I would supervise the release closely. Maybe a few angry bellows and the sight of horns would get the campers packing in a hurry. Before opening the bullpen, I double-checked the rest of my farm to ensure there was no easy way for the bulls to reach the road or neighboring properties. I had triple-locked the gates that led to the main roads. The only real risk was the campers themselves. If they'd set up too close to the southern meadow, they'd be in for a wake-up call. I took a deep breath, wondering if this was too extreme. But then I pictured Karen casually inviting dozens of strangers to treat themselves to my land, ignoring the damage to my soil and crops. That woman needed a reality check. I cranked open the heavy latch and let Doc nudge the gate with his massive forehead. He gave a low rumble, like he was annoyed I'd kept him pinned up for so long. The others followed suit, trotting out in a line as they caught wind of the morning air. I trailed behind, my boots crunching over the scattered hay. As we made our way to the meadow, I saw the first signs of stirring among the tents. A few people poking their heads out to greet the dawn, probably expecting a calm sunrise. Boy, were they in for a surprise. Doc and Butch lumbered toward the tents, heads swinging as they sniffed the unfamiliar environment. A wide-eyed man in sweatpants unzipped his tent flap, only to come face-to-face with Doc's colossal horns. He let out a yelp that could wake the dead, and in an instant, the campsite was alive with commotion. Folks dashed out, stumbling over sleeping bags, frantically searching for shoes. A couple of them tried to scramble up trees, while others clutched their kids and hustled them to the safety of their vehicles. I stood at a distance, leaning on the pasture fence, giving an occasional whistle to keep the bulls from venturing off too far. I was more than a little amused, though I kept my face neutral in case anyone spotted me. The sense of indignation in the air was palpable, like they couldn't believe someone had the gall to release livestock on farmland. One man shouted, "Who let these bulls out? This is dangerous." Another demanded, "Where's Karen? She said this was safe." That was my cue. I walked in, calm as could be, as the crowd parted like a school of fish around shark. "Morning, folks," I called. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" My voice had a casual drawl, like I had no idea why they were so panicked. "Don't mind the bulls. This is their grazing area." I motioned to the meadow. "I reckon they're confused about all these tents." Karen emerged from a tent decorated with pink and white stripes, her hair disheveled and her expression a mix of outrage and fear. "Tom," she spluttered, "what's the meaning of this? You can't just unleash dangerous animals on us." "Dangerous?" I feigned ignorance. "Karen, these are my livestock. They graze here every morning. If you'd asked my permission before hosting your event, I might have warned you to set up your tents in the far field. But see, you never asked." She glared daggers at me, but couldn't quite form a coherent reply. Meanwhile, the bulls were moving among the campers, sniffing anything that smelled remotely edible. One impatient fellow started honking his car horn to shoo them away, and Doc responded with a low grunt that sent the man speeding off in reverse. As the chaos reached a crescendo, I calmly retrieved a large bucket of feed, shaking it to guide the bulls back toward the penned area. "Easy now," I murmured, expertly steering them. I wanted them visible enough to scare the campers, but not so wild that they'd actually charge. Within minutes, the smell of feed coaxed Doc and the others away from the tents. The crowd stood there, hearts pounding, eyes wide. Several families already had their gear shoved in their trunks, ready to vacate. Karen cleared her throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Listen up, everyone," she announced, her voice shaky but determined. "We'll just move our tents a bit further from a meadow. Tom, you need to keep those animals in check. We have every right to be here." It was like she'd read from the official HOA handbook of entitlement. My patience once again threatened to snap. "Karen," I said, stepping forward so only she could hear me, "these are my acres. You do not have a right to set up camp here. You have no lease, no agreement, nothing. You are trespassing." She huffed, flipping her hair with a defiant flourish. "This isn't over," she insisted. "I'm going to call Dwayne, and we'll settle this once and for all. I'll get approval for an extended community campout, and you'll be obligated to accommodate us." "I look forward to that," I said, my tone icy. I watched her march away, phone in hand, likely about to harass the entire HOA board. Meanwhile, the rest of the campers scrambled to salvage what was left of their morning. Many of them shot me resentful looks. But a few, maybe the more reasonable souls, mumbled apologies, realizing how bizarre the situation was. I didn't attempt to chase them off just yet, though part of me itched to do so. Instead, I decided to wait and see how Karen's official approach might play out. If she thought she could twist the HOA's arm into forcing me to host her 100-person jamboree, well, she was in for a rude awakening. But in the back of my mind, I wondered if she had other tricks up her sleeve. The HOA world can be ruthless, and Karen was just the type to escalate if she thought she was losing. True to form, Karen wasted no time stirring the pot. By midday, I spotted Dwayne's familiar navy sedan creeping up my driveway. He stepped out, wearing a pressed white shirt and a resigned look that told me he wanted to be anywhere else. I've known Dwayne a while. He's one of those sticklers for procedure, but not a bad guy at heart. If there's one person who tries to keep the HOA from descending into chaos, it's him. That day, however, he seemed overwhelmed, like he'd already fielded a dozen furious phone calls. "Tom," he greeted, shaking my hand in a weary way. "We got a situation." I led him away from the tents to the relative quiet near my barn. "Let me guess. Karen's demanding the HOA formally sponsor this campout on my land?" He nodded and massaged his temples as though to ward off a headache. "That's exactly it. She's claiming that it's a legitimate community event and that you agreed to allow it before, but now you're suddenly changing your mind and releasing bulls. She's portraying it as some kind of malicious sabotage on your part. She's lying, I said plainly, crossing my arms. Not once did I give her permission. She concocted this scheme on her own, probably to gain favor with neighbors or to feed her ego. All she did was tell me, after the fact, that the crowd was already here. Dwayne sighed. I figured as much. Look, the HOA board does not approve of this. Karen bypassed protocol. But you know how she is. She's convinced that if she can rally enough residents to sign a petition, the board will have to retroactively endorse the event. I felt a simmer of irritation. Well, you can tell her the board doesn't have authority over my land. Petition or no petition, I'm not part of the HOA. She's out of bounds. Agreed, Dwayne said, nodding. But she won't go quietly. She's convinced that if she causes enough trouble, she can either force you to back down or get the county involved. He hesitated before adding, she's even threatened to spin this into a health and safety violation, claiming your bulls are a menace and that you're endangering families. The nerve of that woman. On my own property, I muttered. Well, she can squawk all she wants. This isn't my first rodeo, Dwayne. I know where the boundaries are, legally speaking. I haven't done anything wrong. I let my bulls out to graze on my land, which is what I do every day. If people choose to pitch tents in the bull's path, that's on them. Dwayne glanced over his shoulder at the campsite. Some of the folks were still lingering, though their morning shock had settled into a tense calm. Look, I'll try to talk sense into them, he offered. But I can't guarantee Karen will back off. She's stubborn, and she's got a knack for stirring up half-truths. I nodded my thanks, and Dwayne walked off toward the tents. I watched as he gathered a few straggling campers around, presumably urging them to pack up. Karen hovered nearby, arms folded, face frozen in her trademark scowl. At one point, I saw her raise her voice, pointing in my direction, and Dwayne responded with a firm hand gesture that made her stomp her foot like a petulant child. It was almost comical, if it wasn't happening on my land. Sure enough, a good chunk of the campers seemed fed up with the fiasco. One by one, they carried their gear to their vehicles, shot me a few apologetic glances, and left. But some, the more die-hard Karen supporters, remained, set on proving, what exactly? That they had the right to lounge on a stranger's property indefinitely? The logic escaped me. Regardless, that evening found me with about 30 stubborn campers still entrenched, forming a miniature tent city just beyond my orchard. Every once in a while, I'd see them gather in clusters, probably plotting how to outlast the mean old farmer. I try to spend my day tending to normal chores, fixing a broken fence post, checking the irrigation lines, ensuring the livestock had enough feed. But the tension was like a constant buzz in my ears. I caught glimpses of Karen pacing back and forth with her phone, pointing at areas of my property as if making a list of complaints. The slope of the terrain, the humidity, the lack of clean restroom facilities, anything she thought might be used against me. Little did she know, I keep my paperwork in perfect order. My farm is up to every code in the county. Whatever angle she was trying to find, I doubted she'd succeed. Still, I had to remain vigilant. Early that afternoon, I took my four-wheeler on a slow ride around the perimeter of my land, just to keep an eye on potential sabotage. I half expected to find new trenches dug, or see that the campers had decided to roast esmores in the middle of my carefully planted rows. For the most part, though, they stayed in their designated tent area, presumably waiting for some kind of official victory. Around dusk, I parked near the orchard. A few older women from Karen's group approached me. I steeled myself, ready for an onslaught of complaints, but their demeanor seemed conciliatory. "We're sorry about all this," one of them said. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice. "We just thought it would be a nice outing. Karen made it sound like you'd given your blessing." Her friend nodded. "I've never slept outdoors a day in my life," she admitted, looking around as the shadows deepened. "It sounded exciting, but all this drama, it's not worth it. We're leaving in the morning." "It's no problem," I said, softening my tone. "I appreciate you talking to me directly. Next time, just ask me yourselves. We can figure something out that doesn't involve trespassing or angering livestock." I tried to crack a small smile, and they laughed awkwardly, as though they felt silly for being duped. As the women headed back to their tents, I spied Karen glowering from a distance. This was not going according to her plan. If her minions deserted, she'd have no leverage. That fact alone made me rest easier. Tomorrow, I thought, most of them would be gone. In my mind, the matter was nearly settled. That night, though, a text pinged on my phone from a neighbor down the road. "Heads up, Tom. Rumor is Karen's filing an emergency complaint with the county about your dangerous livestock. She's also collecting signatures to demand that the sheriff remove them from your land. Thought you should know." I exhaled slowly, annoyance churning in my gut. Not surprising. And yet the idea that she'd resort to weaponizing local authorities left me uneasy. I have friends in the county offices, folks who trust my stewardship of the farm. But I also knew how these things could spiral if the wrong official got the wrong story. Headlines like "Farmer Harris's local families with bulls" write themselves. And Karen was exactly the type to spin such a tale. So be it, I decided. If she wanted a showdown, she'd get one. I wasn't going to roll over just because she pinned her hopes on some bureaucratic technicality. This farm was my inheritance, my livelihood, and the very heart of my family's legacy. No overzealous HOA crusader was going to rob me of it. I went to bed that night determined to protect my property, whatever it took. Morning light brought a slight drizzle, softening the ground and leaving a mist that floated through the orchard. The next wave of campers, the ones who realized their nature retreat was more trouble than it was worth, were hastily packing up. I couldn't help but feel a measure of relief as I saw more vehicles pulling out. By 8 a.m., only a handful of tents remained, led, of course, by Karen's striped monstrosity in the center. I was checking on my hens in their coop when I heard the rumble of engines. Glancing out, I saw 2 county vehicles making their way down my gravel driveway. My heart sank for a moment, but I summoned a calm resolve. In my experience, being polite and forthright with officials usually does more good than panic or hostility. A tall, stern-faced sheriff's deputy stepped out first, adjusting his belt and squinting at the campsite in the distance. Following him was a county inspector, an older fellow with thick glasses and an air of reluctant duty. Karen practically sprinted to meet them, hair drenched from the drizzle, her voice carrying across the yard as she ranted about my dangerous, aggressive bulls and the filthy conditions that were threatening public safety. I approached at my own pace, tipping my hat politely. "Mornin', officers," I said, feeling the drizzle soak into my jacket. "Name's Tom Harris. I own this land." The sheriff nodded. "We got a complaint about livestock endangering citizens and a potential code violation for unauthorized campgrounds." I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Well, this is private property. The folks camping here didn't ask my permission. I never designated campground. And as for the livestock, I release my bulls to graze every day. This is a farm, after all. Karen pounced on the opening. "He's reckless. He practically set those bulls on us yesterday morning. Nearly trampled children. This land is not zoned for large-scale events. And he's refusing to provide basic sanitation or safety measures for the people here." I took a breath to steady my voice. "With all due respect, ma'am, there is no large-scale event. Just trespassing." I explicitly told Karen and her group they were not welcome without proper arrangements. And I don't see why I should be forced to accommodate them. I gestured to the small cluster of tents behind her. I did not charge them. I did not invite them. I can't imagine how I'd be required to follow campground regulations for a situation I didn't authorize. The inspector flipped through a clipboard. "Let's keep this civil," he murmured. "If there's no formal event, then the zoning question might be moot. However, the presence of so many people on the land might trigger public safety concerns. Are there restroom facilities, proper trash disposal, etc.? Portable toilets were dropped off without my consent," I said. "I have no say in their maintenance. As for trash, I see they've scattered it around, and I've had to clean up multiple times. There are burn pits that damage the soil, all done without my permission." The deputy studied Karen. "Ma'am, do you have a signed agreement or any written permission allowing you and your group to be here?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have an understanding. He's just being difficult now because he doesn't like the HOA. This farmland is huge. He's barely using most of it. That's not how property rights work, the deputy replied coolly. We can't force Mr. Harris to host an event he never agreed to. If you're trespassing, you need to leave. She sputtered, turning red. This isn't fair. We're a community. We just wanted a peaceful retreat. Then he brought out those bulls. He's the one who escalated it. I folded my arms. Lady, it's my routine to release the bulls each morning. This is not a recreational park. If you're worried about the animals, maybe you should camp somewhere else. A tense silence settled in, broken only by the patter of drizzle on the gravel. Finally, the inspector cleared his throat. Miss Karen, if you and your group refuse to vacate, you could be cited for trespassing. Mr. Harris is well within his rights to manage his livestock as he sees fit, provided he follows existing agricultural regulations. He turned to me, adjusting his glasses. Tom, I'd like to do a quick walkthrough of your livestock area, just to confirm everything's up to code and that the animals aren't being mishandled. I nodded. Sure thing. I led him to the bullpen and showed him the sturdy fencing, the feeding stations, and the water troughs. He noted the conditions on his clipboard, quietly humming in approval. Then, with one last glance around, he clicked his pen and said, Everything here seems in order. Meanwhile, the deputy was explaining to Karen that she'd have to leave or face legal consequences. Her voice rose an octave as she tried to argue, but the law was the law. One by one, the last remaining tents came down. People lugged soggy, sleeping bags into the trunks of their SUVs. Karen herself looked ready to burst with indignation, threatening lawsuits and petitions with every breath. But as the county vehicles pulled away, it became evident she had lost this battle. I hovered by my barn door, arms resting on the top half, as Karen trudged across the muddy grass. Her shoes were caked in soil, her expression somewhere between furious and humiliated. She stopped a few feet away, glaring at me. You've made an enemy of me, she snapped. I have influence, Tom. You'll regret this. I met her gaze. I'm not looking for enemies, Karen. I'm just a man protecting what's mine. If you'd asked me properly, maybe we could have found a middle ground. But you decided to trample on my rights instead. Her mouth twitched, but she said nothing. She yanked open her car door and tossed her muddy shoes inside, driving off in a huff. With each camper gone, the fields were finally empty of tents. I surveyed the mess they'd left behind. Scorched circles where fires had been, scattered trash, and trampled patches of grass where my new seedlings had once stood. It would take a fair bit of work to restore my land to its prior state. But as the drizzle tapered off and the morning sun began to peek through the clouds, I felt a sense of relief and triumph. Yes, I'd have to repair the damage, but that was far preferable to letting Karen or the HOA run roughshod over my farmland. I strolled back to the bullpen and whistled to Doc and Butch. They approached with their usual slow curiosity, probably wondering if more intruders had come for an early morning adrenaline rush. I patted Doc's broadside, feeling the powerful muscle beneath the hide. This is our home, I murmured, and nobody's going to take that away from us. In the days that followed, I stayed prepared for any fallout from Karen's threatened influence. But as word got around that I was in the right, thanks in no small part to the sheriff's deputy and county inspector, a surprising thing happened. Neighbors who had previously sided with the HOA approached me with sheepish apologies or supportive nods. The fiasco had shown them that Karen's authoritarian streak wasn't always beneficial, even for those inside the homeowners association. A few even volunteered to help me restore the pasture, offering to lay down fresh seed or cart away leftover debris. Maybe I made a few new friends that week, folks who understood that respect for land and property is a two-way street. And maybe Karen learned a lesson, though knowing her, that's a coin toss. Regardless, the farm remained mine, as it had for generations, with the sunrise lighting the fields each morning and my bulls roaming free as they were born to do. If there's one thing I'm certain of, it's this: you don't mess with a farmer's land. Not unless you're prepared to face the consequences at the break of dawn, hoofed, horned, and entirely at home. The end.